Montana Territory. September 1879, the first shot cracked across the Pine Ridge like a whip, and by the time the second rang out, Vayda Collins was already running barefoot, her wedding dress ripped to the knees, blood on her shoulder from the brush's bite. She did not look back. The woods north of her father's land were thick with spruce and trembling aspen, and the ground was soft with needles and moss. She ran until her lungs burned, until the screams behind her were swallowed by the forest. Her veil had been torn off hours ago. Her corset hung loose, strings cut by her own shaking hands. She had not married the man they chose for her. She was meant for another man, a man her father had shaken hands with in front of the whole town. Clayton Barrick, the banker's 39-year-old son with a face like stone and fists to match. They said he would give her a steady life. What they meant was he would keep her caged like a canary in a too-small box. But Vayda had not been born to stay quiet. She stumbled through the woods, night falling fast, and when her legs gave out, she crawled. Her body shook with cold and panic, but she kept moving. Her mind flashed to her mother's grave, to the last real hug she ever had, and then to the stranger with the quiet eyes who had helped her load her horse 2 weeks ago at the general store. He had touched his hat and said, "You dropped a glove, miss." She had not dropped it. She had left it. His name had been Asa Zeller. Cowboy, quiet voice, broad chest, hands like they knew the shape of work. He had looked straight at her, not through her, and something in her chest had stirred. Now she prayed to whatever God would listen that she could find him again. By dawn, her feet were torn, her dress black with mud. She had followed the creek, just like the old trapper once said to do. Creek runs east, east runs to the range, and there you'll find the open trail. She was ready to collapse when she saw smoke curling above the trees. She crawled the last stretch, sobbing now, desperate, every inch of her body screaming for rest. And then she saw the cabin, rough-hewn logs, a horse tied out front, a man stepping out with a rifle in hand. He stared at her, frozen. "Asa," she gasped, and then the world went black. When she woke, she was in a bed softer than anything she had known. Her shoulder was bandaged, her feet wrapped. The fire crackled nearby, and a quilt was tucked up to her chin. He was sitting in the corner, hat in his hands, watching her. "You ran," he said quietly. She nodded. "You hurt?" "Just tired," she whispered. He stood, walked to her, and poured her a tin cup of water. His hand brushed hers as he passed it, and for the first time in days she didn't flinch. "I have to go back," she said. "No, you do not. My father is not here." She looked up at him. "They'll come looking," he nodded. "Let them. I will not let anyone take you." Something in her broke then. She started crying, the kind that came from deep in the gut, and he let her. He sat beside her, not touching, just close. "You do not even know me," she said after some time. "I know you ran through the woods alone, bleeding. That tells me enough." She turned her face toward the fire. "He would have killed me." "I believe you." She looked back at him. "Why are you being kind?" He stared at the flames. "Because no one was kind to my sister when she needed it." They sat in silence after that. The wind shifted outside. A hawk cried overhead. She dozed. By the third day she could walk barefoot, still but steady. Asa had given her one of his old shirts to wear and a pair of canvas trousers rolled at the waist. She helped him feed the horses. She chopped wood until her arms gave out, and he made her sit down and eat. "You think they will come here?" she asked, watching him saddle his mare. "Your father," she nodded. He shrugged. "Maybe, but this land doesn't belong to him." A silence hung between them. "You do not talk much," she said. "I never saw much use in it. You talk to me." He looked at her then, and his voice was low. "Because I want to." That night she sat outside while he smoked by the fence. The stars were so bright they hurt her eyes. "I was supposed to marry Clayton Barrick," she said. "I figured. He said he would tame me." You are not a horse." She looked at him, surprised. He was watching the sky. "You are not meant to be broken." She stood and walked to him. Her hand brushed his sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered. He turned to face her. "You do not owe me thanks." Her eyes welled again. "I owe you everything." "No," he said. "You are free now. What you do next is yours." She stood so close he could feel the warmth of her. "I want to stay," she said, his jaw flexed. "Then stay." A week passed. Then two. They lived quiet, steady days, her healing, him working. She learned to ride bareback. He taught her how to fire a rifle. She cooked over the stove and sang when she thought he was not listening. But he always was. She caught him watching her once, and her heart kicked in her chest. She did not look away. Neither did he. That night, after supper, he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "Vayda," he said slowly, "I do not want to speak out of turn." "Then do not," she whispered. He froze. She leaned in. "Say it plain," he swallowed. "I want to marry you." Her breath caught. "I know it is sudden, and you have been through more than I will ever understand. But I would treat you right. I would never raise a hand to you, never cage you. I would just be your husband, if you want that." Tears filled her eyes. "I do." "You do," she laughed, crying now. "Yes, Asa. I do." They married in town 3 days later under the cottonwood tree behind the church. No guests, just the old preacher and the wind. She wore a blue dress and he wore his Sunday shirt. He held her hand the whole time. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Asa looked to her for permission. She nodded once and he kissed her like he meant it. She was meant for another man, but she had escaped through the woods. And now, she was his wife. The first frost came early that year. By late October, the wind carried a dry sharpness that cut through even the thickest wool, and the sky turned the color of pewter just after supper. Asa had begun waking before dawn to split extra pine, and Vayda had taken to boiling the wash water inside to keep it from freezing before she could scrub with it. They had been married 3 weeks. The rhythm of the days had settled into something quiet but full. She stitched new curtains from a bolt of calico she found tucked behind a crate of nails in the barn. He rebuilt the chicken coop with salvaged boards once used for a freight crate. They rarely spoke much while working, but when they did, their words came easy, like they'd been speaking to one another for years, not days. One afternoon, with the sun low and the smell of fresh-cut cedar still on his coat, Asa leaned against the fence post while she shelled beans on the porch steps. "My mother liked to sit like that," he said, not quite looking at her. Vayda paused, fingers stilling over the basin. "Do you talk of her often?" "No." She waited. "She died in the spring I turned 16. Fever took her quick. By the time we sent for help, she was already gone. My pa, he wasn't much good after that." Asa's voice had the slow weight of someone unearthing something buried too long. "I'm sorry you lost her young," she said, not softly but steadily, the way she'd want someone to speak to her if the roles were reversed. Asa rubbed the rim of his hat between his palms. "She used to sing to the goats, not well but with heart. I remember that more than anything." Vayda smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I can't carry a tune either, but I hum when I'm nervous. I noticed." She glanced up, cheeks flushing. He straightened, eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary, then cleared his throat. "Do you miss town, the noise, other women to talk to?" "No," she said. "I like it quiet." He nodded once and went back to work. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind traced along the chimney stones, she stood brushing out her hair near the window. Asa sat by the hearth, carving a button from a scrap of bone. The soft rasp of his knife was the only sound between them until she spoke. "I never told you what I brought with me." He looked up. "I left with nothing but the dress on my back, but I hid my mother's brooch in my boot. I couldn't bear to leave it behind. She crossed to the table and opened the drawer. From beneath a folded handkerchief, she drew out a small silver pin shaped like a daisy, the edges worn smooth. She wore it every Sunday. I used to press it into the hymnal when I was small, like a pressed flower. He rose and came to her side. "You're lucky you kept it. I think it kept me." He traced a finger along the edge of the brooch, then looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes. "You're steadier than most men I've met," she said. "I've had reason to be." She didn't ask what that meant. The first snow came 2 days later. It fell heavy and wet, sticking to the branches and piling along the cabin's eaves. They worked together to tar the window edges and lay down extra straw in the barn. Nights grew longer, and the space between them grew smaller. One morning she woke to find him sitting at the edge of their bed, already dressed, boots laced. "You hear that?" he asked. She sat up, listening. Hooves, more than one rider, coming fast. He reached for the rifle, leaning against the door frame, his jaw tight. "Stay inside." She stood. "I'm not hiding." He turned, eyes sharp. "If it's someone looking to take you back, I'll send them off, but I need to know you're safe behind me." She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. "Only if you promise not to fire unless you have to." He hesitated, then gave a short nod. She stepped back, heart hammering. 2 riders came into view by the time Asa stepped out. Both wore wide-brimmed hats pulled low against the cold, dust still clinging to their coats. "We're looking for a woman," the older one called out. "Small, brown hair. Might be traveling with a man." Asa didn't move from the porch. "Ain't seen anyone pass this way." "You sure?" "She ran off from her family, might be in trouble." "She's not here." The younger rider shifted in his saddle. "We've got a name. Vayda Collins. Know it." Asa's voice stayed even. "I don't take kindly to men hunting women like game." The older rider narrowed his eyes. "We're not hunting. We're looking to make things right." Asa stepped down from the porch. "Then you'll understand when I say she's not yours to find." There was a long silence. The older man finally tipped his hat. "If you see her, tell her her father's offering forgiveness." Asa didn't answer. The riders turned and left without another word. When he came back inside, Vayda stood holding her breath. "You heard?" he asked. She nodded. "They won't be back." "How can you be sure?" "Because I saw the fear in that older one's eyes. Men like that don't come back once they realize someone's willing to stand between them and what they want." She stepped forward. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again." Asa set the rifle down and reached for her hand. "You don't have to think that anymore." She closed the space between them, resting her forehead to his chest. Outside, snow continued to drift down, soft and unbothered. Inside, the silence was no longer empty. Late November brought a wind that moved low through the valley, brushing the tops of the snowdrifts like a hand across linen. Vayda had taken to mending by the window, where the light stayed longest. Asa carved fence posts in the barn, though the ground was too frozen to set them. There was comfort in the motion, even when it served no immediate purpose. One morning, she found him at the table sorting a stack of old envelopes bound in twine. He didn't offer an explanation, and she didn't ask until she saw the return address printed in a precise hand across the top: Fort Benton, Montana Territory. "You've kept these a long while," she said, brushing her fingers across the stiff paper. "They're from a friend." "Served with the 5th Infantry," he said, not looking up. "He wrote often until 76, stopped after the campaign ended." "Was he lost?" "No, he stayed east. Married a girl from Boston and took up teaching. Said he didn't want to carry a rifle again unless it was for hunting meat." She turned one of the letters over in her hand. "Did you serve with him?" "I was too young, but I worked at the fort mucking stalls, fixing gear, hauling water. Heard all the stories. I never wanted to live myself." She set the letters down. "You miss him." I miss the way he listened. He never talked like he knew everything. Just asked questions until you figured it out yourself. Vayda watched him tuck the stack back into a tin box and slide it beneath the floorboard by the hearth. "I could write him for you," she said. "If you want." He considered that a long moment. "Maybe come spring." She nodded. Later that week, they rode out to check the trap line a mile north, where the creek curved against the ridge and the trees grew close enough to keep off the worst of the wind. Vayda had taken to riding his buckskin mare, a sure-footed thing with a gentle mouth. They'd bundled in layers, her scarf wrapped tight against her jaw. A fox had taken one of the baited snares, but the rest hung empty. Asa reset the trip line. Vayda crouched nearby, brushing frost from a patch of lichen. "My mother used to boil this with pine bark for cough," she said. "Tasted like dirt and sap." He glanced over. "Did it help?" "No, but she swore it did." She pulled off a glove and pressed her palm flat to the frozen ground. "I think I remember her hands better than her face." Asa stood, brushing snow from his knees. "What were they like?" "Calloused." "Smelled like dill and wood smoke." She always kept a sliver of soap in her apron pocket, even when we had nothing else. They rode back in silence. That night, she pulled the quilt tighter around their bed and whispered, "I want to plant dill in the spring." He reached for her hand beneath the covers and squeezed gently. "We will." The next week brought a letter from the county clerk, delivered by a trapper on his way south. It bore Asa's name in careful script, sealed with wax that cracked in the cold. He read it twice before handing it to her. She scanned the lines, brow furrowing. "Your father passed," he nodded once. "Were you close?" "No, but he was my blood." And some part of me thought maybe he'd write one day and say he'd changed. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "Did you want to go back?" "There's nothing for me there." She hesitated. "Would you want to take his land if it's offered?" He met her eyes. "I'd rather build something of our own, not inherit something I never belonged to." She reached across the table and touched his wrist. "Then we'll stay here and make it ours." That winter, they began sketching what the spring would hold. She wanted a small herb garden. He spoke of fencing in the lower pasture. They marked where the root cellar should sit and talked of building a smokehouse with stone from the creek. When the river thawed, they planned to ride to Missoula for sugar and seed and coils of wire. But for now, there was firewood to stack and stew to stir and the hush of snow against window panes. One night, as they lay curled together, she whispered, "Sometimes I think I dreamed you, that I imagined a man who wouldn't try to own me." He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his voice low. "You're not something to be owned, Vayda." She looked up at him, the dim firelight catching the edge of his jaw. "I know. I just didn't know anybody else did." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then her lips, slow and sure. Outside, the wind moved on, but inside, the warmth held. And in the space between their words, something deepened, something rooted not in rescue, but in choice. The thaw came slow, seeping into the bones of the earth like a secret. By mid-March, the snow had loosened its grip on the fields, and patches of hardened grass showed in the hollows where the wind had scraped the banks bare. Sap ran in the trees again. The air smelled faintly of wet bark and ash. Vayda stood at the edge of the paddock, sleeves rolled to her elbows and hem soaked with meltwater. She leaned into the fence rail, watching Asa settle a new bridle on the bay gelding he'd traded for 2 weeks prior. The horse had a nervous gait, but Asa moved patient, hands steady as a clockmaker's. "I've never seen a horse twitch like that and still take the bit," she said. He turned his head just enough to see her. "He's got memory of being struck. You can feel it in the way he flinches." She watched the gelding's ears flick. "You going to keep him?" "I aim to give him a reason to trust." She didn't reply, but later, when she brought out a pail of oats, she let the gelding smell her palms before she moved close. He didn't startle. That night, she stitched the last of the canvas sacks they planned to use for seed. Asa sat cross-legged on the floor a few feet away, stripping down the scabbard for his rifle, checking the stitching. The lantern between them cast long shadows against the cabin walls. "Did you always want land?" she asked, eyes on her needle. "No," he said. "Didn't seem like something I had a right to." "What changed that?" He took a moment. "You did." She set the sack down. "You mean because I came here?" "I mean because you looked at this place same way I did. Not for what it was, but for what it could be." The room went quiet again, the kind of quiet that didn't press down but held steady, like a held breath. As the days stretched longer, Vayda began marking time with the garden. She cleared the southern plot with a spade, turning the soil with her back and shoulders until sweat ran down her spine. Asa built a low rail fence around it, not to keep anything out, but to mark the edge of what they were building together. One afternoon, while she knelt planting dill beside the early onions, she heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Asa stepped into the garden row, wiping his hands on a rag. "I ran into a boy from town this morning," he said. She looked up. "He brought word from the sheriff. A fire took the barrack house down to stone." Her hands stilled in the dirt. "Anyone hurt?" "No one was inside. Clayton's gone south, took what money he could and disappeared." She sat back on her heels. "So it's over." "It's been over since the day you walked into these woods." She dusted her palms, not meeting his eyes. "I believed for a long time that men like him always got what they wanted." Asa crouched beside her. "Not this time." She nodded once. "I don't feel sorry." "You don't have to." Her hand found his on the edge of the fence rail. He didn't move it. That evening they walked the ridge above the cabin where the pines thinned and the grass grew in tufts between the granite. The wind was cool but not bitter. She leaned into his side as they looked out over the valley. "Would you ever want children?" she asked, not turning her head. He took a breath before answering. "If you did." "I think I might, one day. I'd like to raise them here," he said. "Let them see what it is to build with their own hands." She smiled softly. "And never teach them to fear their own voice." "No," he said, "never that." They stood a while in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Below, the creek shimmered with the last light of the day, winding its way through the land that was slowly becoming theirs. When they returned to the cabin, she lit the lamp and poured water into the basin. He stepped behind her, arms circling her waist, his chin resting just above her shoulder. She leaned into the warmth of him, eyes closing. "I never thought I'd feel this," she said. "What's that?" "Like the future could be mine." He kissed the crown of her head, voice low. "It always was. You just had to walk far enough to find it." She turned then, hands drifting up to his collar. He kissed her slow, like he wasn't afraid of time anymore. Outside, the night deepened. The stars held their place. And inside, with the fire burning low, they stood together, two souls no longer running, no longer hiding, only choosing, every quiet hour, to stay. The first warm rains came in April, drawing steam from the soil and turning the hills a deeper green than the months before had allowed. Vayda stood beneath the sloped overhang of the barn roof, palms open to catch the drops. The scent of wet wood and warming earth clung to the air, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a meadowlark called out its note. Inside, Asa was scraping the last of the winter soot from the stovepipe, sleeves rolled and brow streaked with ash. He glanced over when she stepped in, boots leaving damp prints across the threshold. "You're soaked." "I like the rain," she said, unwrapping her scarf and hanging it near the door peg. "It reminds me I'm still here." He wiped his hands and crossed to her, resting one calloused palm against her cheek. "You're more than here," he said. "You're alive." She leaned into his touch a moment before reaching into her pocket. "I found something near the garden." He opened his hand, and she placed a smooth river stone in it, faintly heart-shaped, marbled with red veins. Was wedged between the roots of the dill. Thought it belonged in this house. He turned it over once, then set it on the windowsill beside the tin of matches. "We'll keep it there," he said. "For luck." By mid-May, the trees leafed out fully, and the fields began to hold color in long swaths. Vayda planted marigold and chamomile beside the cabin, both for their scent and the bees they brought. She'd bartered for a small hive box with a traveling tinsmith who passed through on his way to Deer Lodge, and Asa built her a stand for it with hands that now moved familiar through the tasks of shared life. One evening, while she was stripping dried mint leaves for tea, she paused with a piece of linen in her hand. "I've been thinking about teaching," she said. Asa looked up from the workbench where he was shaping a new latch for the barn door. "What kind?" "Reading. Writing. Maybe numbers if I can find some slates. There are children further west. I met a mother with 3 little ones last month when I rode to the mill. Said they hadn't seen a teacher since the war ended." He sat back, considering. "You'd ride out there, if you'd ride with me," he nodded slowly. "We could take the wagon once a week. Make a day of it," she smiled. "I think I'd like that." They began the visits in early June. The wagon creaked under the weight of slates, chalk, and a box of second-hand readers Vayda had traded preserves for. The children came barefoot and wide-eyed, some barely speaking above a whisper at first. She taught them under a cottonwood tree, using the side of the wagon as a board. Asa sat nearby, sometimes mending tack, sometimes whittling, always listening. One afternoon, after the children had scattered home and the sun was low behind the hills, Vayda sat beside him on the back of the wagon. "I never imagined this," she said. "What part?" "All of it," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "I thought I'd be buried in a marriage I didn't choose. I never thought I'd be teaching letters beside a man who listens more than he speaks." He let his thumb trace the edge of her knuckles. "I never thought I'd have a home built from something other than blood and duty." They sat long after the light faded, and when they returned to the cabin, they lay together with the windows open, the air warm enough to carry the scent of pine and honeysuckle through the room. By late August, the garden had given more than they could carry. Vayda lined the shelves with jars of pickled beans, corn relish, and whole tomatoes. The hive produced enough honey to fill 2 crocks. Asa began cutting timber for a second structure, a shed, he said, but they both knew it would be more. A place for Vayda's lessons come winter. A room for the future. One morning, she stood in the doorway watching him plane boards. He glanced up. "You've got something in your mind." "I might," she said, "but I wanted to be sure first." He set the plane aside and came to face her. "I'm late," she said softly, eyes steady. He blinked, then lifted both hands to her arms. "How long?" 7 weeks. His grip didn't tighten. He only let out a slow breath and nodded. "All right." A pause passed between them, not heavy but full. "You worried?" she asked. "No," he said. "Just thinking of how to build the cradle." She laughed, breath catching. "You'll make it better than anything money could buy." "I'll make it strong," he said. "So it lasts." That night they sat by the fire, her hand resting over her belly, his arm around her shoulders. The warmth between them wasn't new, but it had deepened, grown roots. Their life was no longer something they stumbled into, it was something they shaped, day by day, with patience and care. When the first frost came again, it found them ready. The new shed stood finished with a stove in the corner and shelves along the walls. Vayda had already begun teaching there when the weather grew cold. The children came wrapped in shawls and wool hats, and Asa built a bench long enough for them all. They slept each night in the same bed, their hands finding each other without thought. They spoke less now before sleep, not from distance, but from knowing. Their silences were no longer edged with uncertainty. They were full, like the space between breaths. As winter settled in once more and the stove glowed through the darkest hours, Vayda reached for Asa's hand beneath the quilt. "We did it," she whispered. He turned to her, eyes soft. "We're still doing it." She smiled. "I'm glad I ran." He kissed her temple. "I'm glad you ran to me." And in the quiet, with snow beginning to drift again outside their walls, they lay together, not as two who had escaped something, but as two who had built something that would last. A life made not from the past, but from the ground beneath their feet, the work of their hands, and the steady rhythm of love that had taken root and would not break.